Hello everyone, and welcome to the Keystone Exams Assessment Coordinator Training for the Winter Administration in 2016-17. My name is Charlie Wayne and I'll be doing the presentation today. If you have any accountability questions, please email the RA account listed on the screen, ra-pas@pa.gov. They can answer any accountability questions you might have. Our agenda for today is we'll do an overview. We'll talk very briefly about policy, lots about the Keystone exams, planning, participating, and administering the Keystones. We'll talk about monitoring. We'll talk about security, and we'll talk a little bit about contact information as well. All policy decisions come from PDE. DRC doesn't make policy, but DRC is our primary testing vendor. So they do a lot of work for us. They'll deliver the paper materials. They're in charge of the eDirect, the Insight, the online testing engine, and their customer service number. Customer service phone number is 800-451-7849. And their email address for us, the longest email address in the world, PA Customer Service at datarecognitioncorp.com. There are different reasons in terms of policy and requirements for students to take the Keystone exams. What is a federal requirement? Federal requirements say that students must take a high school exam. For us, that's the Keystone exam. Students have to take that at least once prior to or during the spring administration of their junior year. So in grade 11, they have to have completed it by the time grade 11 ends for that student. If a student takes the Keystone exam and doesn't score at the proficient level or above, they may retake that exam. For students who are graduating prior to 2019, if that student is not proficient on the Keystone exam, they must be offered supplemental instruction. That student doesn't have to accept that supplemental instruction, but it must be offered. And they may retake the Keystone exam without accepting that supplemental instruction. However, for students graduating in 2019 and beyond, supplemental instruction is required. They must be offered the supplemental instruction and they must participate in supplemental instruction before they can retake a Keystone exam. The 2018-19 school year is when the regulations say Keystone exams will be a graduation requirement. Prior to that, it's not a graduation requirement. Several things we're going to talk about here. Lots of print materials. Handbook for Assessment Coordinators. It's a very valuable document. You're going to use that a lot, or at least the school assessment coordinator will use that a lot. We redid the Handbook for Assessment Coordinators, or the HAC, and we redid the Directions for Administration this year. I'm sure there are still going to be issues with some parts of them, but I think that they're both much better documents than they were before. We have read aloud and scribing guidelines for the assessment, the Directions for Administration, also called the DFA, Keystone exams, test definitions, we have scoring guidelines, accommodations guidelines. Our accommodations guidelines are very good. We'll talk more about them later. We have a document for online testing. We have a calculator policy. And we'll talk about calendars. So in the Handbook for Assessment Coordinators, some of the things that we can use in there that are going to help us prepare for the exam is there's things in there about scheduling. We have a document in an appendix to help you notify parents or guardians about the assessment. You can just use that document, adapt it to your own personal needs, your own district needs. We'll help you prepare the students for the assessment. Talk about preparing the classroom for the assessment. We'll talk about if students need extra time during the assessment, what should we do? Scheduling makeup exams. There's a confidentiality agreement in there. Information for the parents. It's kind of like an FAQ. There's a code of conduct for test takers in there. That's in an appendix. And the calculator policy is in an appendix. Also, in the handbook for assessment coordinators of the HAC, there's a little bit about accommodations, but primarily referred to the accommodations guidelines. A little bit about ELLs. Then we'll talk about non-assessed students. What do you do if a student does not take the test? Who has to take the test? Some other stuff in there about withdrawals, home education, things like that. So participation with accommodations. Here are some of the accommodations that are available. You can see the list. I won't read the list to you. There is a 2017 accommodations guideline that's posted on the PDE website, and it's on eDirect. Again, that's a very good, useful document. At the time of this recording, the accommodations webinar hasn't been done yet. That's scheduled for next week. It will probably be posted about a week after this presentation is posted. So you will get to hear a live presentation if you choose. If you choose not to do it live, then it will be posted on our website. The PowerPoint and the recorded webinar will be there. Please note that scribing for the Keystone Literature exam does not require submission of the scribing unique accommodation form as it does for the PSSA ELA test. This is because the Keystone Literature constructed response item does not measure writing skills. The PSSA ELA writing prompt and the TDA response do measure writing skills. If a student is in the country for their first year, officially enrolled in a U.S. school in their first year, they do not have to participate in the Keystone Literature exam. They may, but they don't have to. And if they do participate, their scores won't count for accountability purposes. Either way, if they don't participate, if they do participate, DRC gets a book with their responses. If they don't participate, an unused booklet with the student's label must still be returned to DRC. Word-to-word translation dictionaries, no definitions, just word-to-word translation dictionaries for algebra and biology only. We can't use them for literature. And we can have interpreters or site translators for algebra and biology. Again, not for literature. For algebra and biology, there is also a Spanish version of the test available. And note that for ELLs, or the current term is ELs, English learners, they must participate in the algebra and the biology. And I want to point out that all of these accommodations are voluntary. We can't force accommodations on a student. Still under preparation. Here's some of the things we're going to talk about next. Training, roles and responsibilities, that's a lot of slides, and test security is a lot of slides. Under training, we have the District Assessment Coordinator, or the DAC, School Assessment Coordinator, or SAC, Test Administrator, or TA, and Proctor. All test administrators and all proctors must take and complete the Pennsylvania State Test Administration Training, or PSTAT. Everyone administering or proctoring a test must complete that. SACs and DACs do not have to take it, but it's recommended, so you know what content is there and you know what your test administrators are seeing. Also, we're working on what is essentially a PSTAT for SACs and DACs. If you have any issues with the PSTAT training, contact DRC. Their phone number is 734-1422. Their email for the PSTAT is pstat@datarecognitioncourt.com. So for the District Assessment Coordinator, for the DAC, here's some of your responsibilities. You must attend the required PDE training. Viewing this webinar, listening to this webinar, is attending the training. If there's anything that needs to be updated in eDirect, it's your responsibility to do it for the district. Review the DFAs. Be familiar with them. You may not be administering the test, but you should know what the test administrators have to do. Be very familiar with the Handbook for Assessment Coordinators. And if you're testing online, be familiar with the online user guides. Know what the district policies are for homeschooled students. If a homeschool student comes to you and asks to take the PSSA or the Keystone at your school, what do? Also, same issue with cyber school students. If a cyber school student in your district requests to take the Keystone at your school or at your district, what do? You also have to train school assessment coordinators. Oftentimes, the SAC will accompany the DAC on this webinar or this training. That's great, but you still need to train the SAC because there are district-specific things that happen. One example is the testing schedule. Not every district has the same testing schedule. We at PDE don't set a testing schedule. We give you a testing window. So you have to coordinate with the school assessment coordinator and train the school assessment coordinator on specific things. If we come to monitor, one of the things we're going to ask for is the sign-in sheet and the agenda for that training. Even if you do it informally, even if you have, let's say, 2 SACs, and you sit down in your office for a half hour or an hour and discuss what you're going to do. I understand that that happens, and that's a nice way to do things. However, we still need a sign-in sheet and an agenda. We need to know what you covered and who was there for that training. If your district is a ship to district, not ship to school, then you have to receive and inventory all of the tests. You also then have to distribute those tests to the assessment coordinators, the school assessment coordinators. When testing is done, you have to collect, inventory, package, and return all of those tests to the ERC. If your district is a ship to school district, the SAC has responsibilities for inventorying the tests, packaging and returning the tests, but you still have to oversee all of that. When testing is done, you have to sign the Keystone Exam Security Certification. Make sure testing is done when you sign that. And report any suspected testing violations to PDE as soon as they occur. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. For the SAC, well, the SAC has to be trained by the DAC. Review all the DFAs. Be familiar with them. The SAC is the expert in the school. So the SAC really needs to know pretty much everything. That includes the DFAs and the HAC. Be very familiar with what's in the Handbook for Assessment Coordinators. For this brief period of time, that's probably going to be their Bible. And be familiar with the online user guides if you're testing online, and update eDirect for test administrators. The SAC also has to train test administrators and proctors. Anybody who is a test administrator and proctor, anybody who's involved at that level with testing needs to be trained. Remember that substitute teachers may be present in the testing room, but they can't be TAs or proctors. They may also be in the hallway, watching the hallway, but they just can't be TAs and proctors. If they're in the testing room, we suggest that they're not in the same room as their cooperating teacher. Put them in a different testing room. And all test administrators and proctors must be employed by the district. No volunteers are allowed to be TAs or proctors. Also, the SIAC creates a testing schedule. Sometimes the SIAC isn't the principal, and the principal and the SIAC can work together to create a testing schedule. But ultimately, a testing schedule needs to be created, should be by the SIAC. Make sure to schedule small group settings and extended time. Make sure staff is assigned to supervise breaks and movement to other settings. Now, the breaks could be for students and the breaks could be for other TAs. TAs have to go to the bathroom as well. So make sure there's people available, trained and assigned to supervise breaks and movement. Remember, anytime students move from one location to another during testing, they need to be escorted. They can't move alone and they can't carry their own testing materials. Be prepared if parents want to view the test. This has to be done with a paper and pencil test. So if you're testing online, contact DRC. They'll get a paper booklet to you pretty quickly. Also, for being prepared for parental requests, there has to be a school/district procedure in place to honor parental requests to view the test. We have stuff in our handbook about that, but you can't just take what's in the handbook and use that. It has to be specific to your school and district. And if we're testing online, then the SIAC has to create the test sessions in eDirect. The SIAC is also responsible for making sure there's nothing prohibited on the classroom or hallway walls. Also note that it's not limited to classroom or hallways. Any wall where testing students will be in the area has to be cleared or covered. That includes bathrooms. Typically, there are things hanging on bathroom walls. But just to make sure, anywhere students go during testing, there can be no prohibited materials uncovered on the walls. If it's a ship to district, then the SIAC has to receive the tests from the DAC. If it's a ship to school, they receive the test from directly from DRC. Ship to district, they receive them from the DAC. Ship to school from DRC. As soon as they get the test, they have to inventory them. If they're missing anything, or if they just need additional materials, contact DRC and order those additional materials. The SIAC is responsible for labeling the test booklets. That could be in conjunction with other people, but it's the SIAC's responsibility. That doesn't mean they have to physically do all of them themselves all the time. Also note that they shouldn't be opening the test booklets while they're doing this. All they need is the front cover. When it comes time to test, the SIAC gets the test booklets, the testing materials, to the test administrator. Sometimes they deliver them to the test administrator. Sometimes the TA comes and picks them up. But somehow the SIAC gets them to the TA. Get them to the TA as close to the start of testing as possible. We don't want the tests, the secure test material, in the hands of test administrators for long periods of time prior to testing. What some schools have done is when the test administrators come in the morning, they pick up their test materials, take them to their room, and then sometimes an hour later, testing starts. That's too much time. Ideally, it would be 5 or 10 minutes before testing starts when they pick them up. If we could do it in less time, that would be even better. But they shouldn't have the testing materials in their possession for an extended time prior to testing. During testing, the SIAC should be monitoring what's going on. They should be walking around the halls, peeking in the rooms, seeing if there's anything the TAs or the students might need. As soon as testing is done, they should be collecting the test materials from the TAs. Again, sometimes the TAs deliver them, sometimes the SIAC picks them up, but we don't want the test materials in the testing room with the TAs for an extended period of time. Once the tests are collected, make sure they're all kept in a locked area with controlled and limited access. The only people that should have keys are the people who need to have keys. Ideally, I think that would probably be 2 people. The SAC should have a key and 1 other person in case something happens to the SAC. Hopefully that's never going to happen. And I get that there are times when maybe we need 3 keys, but ideally 2 keys are probably best. At the end of testing, if it's a ship to district, then the SAC gets all the tests and the secure testing materials to the DAC to return to DRC. And the SAC should report any suspected testing violations to the district assessment coordinator. One caveat with all of this, if the SAC suspects the testing violation involves the DAC, then contact PDE. Don't talk to the DAC when you believe that they're the ones involved. At the end of testing, sign the Keystone exam security certification. This has to be done once per testing wave, let's say. So if you're testing in December for biology and let's say literature in January, and you're going to be a test administrator for both of those content areas, sign the Keystone exam security certification once in December when you're done with testing, and then sign it again in January when you're done with testing. If you're not doing that, as soon as you're done with testing, as soon as the TA is completely done with all of their responsibilities for that testing cycle, then they can sign the security certification. You only have to sign it once per testing window, though. You don't have to sign it once for every test session. The TA has to be trained by the school assessment coordinator. Make sure the TA attends those trainings. Again, if we monitor, we're going to ask for a sign-in sheet and an agenda for that training. The TA must complete the PSTAT training. The TA should be intimately familiar with the DFAs. Again, if you're testing online, the online user guides as well. For the DFAs, if you're doing paper and pencil, there should be no surprises in that document, in that booklet, when you're reading it to the students. You should know that very well before you ever start with the students. Be familiar with and follow all the testing protocols in all our test security documents that we have. There's a bubble on the front of the document, on the front of the test, and there's a bubble if you're doing it online that says, I understand the code of conduct for test takers that my test administrator has reviewed with me. Students need to bubble that in to verify that they do understand the code of conduct. Another caveat with that, though, is in most places, the test administrator does review that with the students. They should review it prior to testing, not immediately before testing. At least a day prior to testing, that should be reviewed with the students. Sometimes, though, it's not the test administrator that does the reviewing. Sometimes it's the homeroom teacher. Sometimes it's the content teacher. In at least one building that I visited, the principal had an assembly and went over the code of conduct for test takers with everybody all at once. That's fine. As long as the students are made aware of it and they understand the code of conduct for test takers, it doesn't matter who reviewed it with them. They just have to be aware of it, understand it, and then fill in that bubble. Have students be familiar with the testing procedures prior to the start of testing. We don't want this to be a surprise for them. If students have questions about the directions, answer any questions about the directions. Don't answer any questions about the content, but you can answer questions about the directions. During testing, TAs should be actively monitoring. Actively monitoring means different things to different people. Whatever it means to that test administrator or whatever direction you give them is what they should be doing. They shouldn't be ignoring the students, turning their back on the students, being on a cell phone, being on a computer, leaving the room. That's not actively monitoring. And keep the environment calm, quiet during testing. Make it conducive to testing. The last bullet is bold because it's new this year. Create a seating chart for each testing session, whether it's online or paper and pencil. This way, when we come back and say, well, Johnny and Mary had exactly the same answers for their test, were they sitting next to each other? You'll be able to tell us if they were. You can tell us where they were sitting. So create a seating chart for each testing session. I would suggest that you keep that for 3 years. We didn't make that a mandate, but that's a strong suggestion because we're doing everything else for 3 years. As soon as a student indicates he or she is finished, the TA should collect the test materials. I believe the handbook says, or the DFAs says, when a student finishes, put your answer booklet inside your test booklet and close it and put it on your desk. However, sometimes students just need breaks, and they want to rest for a couple minutes before they go on. So it's okay for a test administrator to ask a student, are you finished, before they collect their test booklet. But don't keep the test booklet on the student's desk after they're finished. Once the testing session is done, somehow the TA gets all the test materials back to the SAC. Again, could be picked up, could be delivered, but it needs to get back to the SAC as soon as possible. And then sign the Keystone exam security certification when they're done testing for that testing window or wave. Report any suspected violations to the SAC. You could also report it to the DAC, and if you think either of those people are involved in a security violation, you can report it to PDE. Lots of slides on test security. The first thing is the PA Secure ID distribution list. Schools are required to have a list of all of the students taking the test by PA Secure ID, not by name. PDE isn't allowed to have student names, but we can see PA Secure IDs. So if we come to monitor and you have a list of all the students taking the test, but names are on there, you're going to get dinged for that because we can't see names. We just want the PA Secure ID. We want the year, the school, the subject, the grade, and that's a little bit fuzzy if we're doing the Keystones because it could be mixed grade levels in there, but record the grade. If it's all the same grade, we can put all of this stuff in a heading. Year, grade, school, subject. And we want the test administrator's name. So the way that I would do it is I would have a heading for ABC School, 2016 Winter Keystone Administration, Algebra 1. And then I would have the PA Secure ID. Next to the PA Secure ID would be the test administrator's name for all of those students. Again, don't include student names on this list. We don't want student names. Keep this list for at least 3 years. Lots of people do it in an Excel sheet. Some people have student management software. They can do it through the student management software. That's fine. As long as you have this, PDE sometimes requests that information. So you need to have it for at least 3 years. I don't like to read slides. This is what I want to read because I don't want to mess it up. This is very important. The assessments rely on the measurement of individual achievement. Any deviation from assessment procedures is strictly prohibited and will be considered a violation of test security. School personnel who are involved in the assessment program must maintain the security of all assessment materials at all times. Test administrators should not have secure assessment materials in their possession at any time other than during the actual assessment administration. Note that they can have things like the directions for administration, and they should have that in their possession prior to the administration of the assessment. Everybody involved in the assessment has to sign a Keystone exam security certification. The district assessment coordinator, the school assessment coordinator, test administrators, proctors, the principal, and anybody else handling the secure materials. That could be a custodian, it could be a secretary, anybody else involved needs to sign that test security certification. There's a general one for folks who don't fit any of those categories. These must be kept on hand for at least 3 years. Don't send them back to DRC. They don't want them. PDE doesn't want them. Keep them at your place for at least 3 years. If someone is involved in the assessment and they choose not to sign it, we need to know why, and we need to know what's being done about it. So let PDE know, the superintendent, the chief executive officer, chief academic officer needs to let us know what are the consequences to this person not signing it. We have had 1 or 2 instances where someone didn't sign it for valid reasons. So what we did is we had to make a note on their security certification statement what the issue was, and then they signed it, and that was acceptable. This is also new. If there's a violation of test security, here's the contact information. You can call PDE at 844-415-1651, or you can email us at ra-ed-pssa-keystone@pa.gov. Remember, for email addresses, capitalization doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if it's PSSA lowercase or uppercase. It's ra-ed-pssa-keystone@pa.gov or 844-415-1651 to report any security violations. Tests must be secured and accounted for at all times. Now we're talking about the chain of custody. We need to know, or you need to know, at all times where every single test is. DACs have to inventory the test, keep them locked up with limited access. SACs have to inventory the test, keep them locked up with limited access. TAs shouldn't get any secure test materials too long before or keep them too long after the test is being administered. And you need to use a sign-in and sign-out sheet. So when the TAs get the tests, whether they pick them up or whether they're delivered, there needs to be a sign-in and sign-out sheet where they sign their name that they received all this material. We also strongly recommend that the tests are counted together, the TA and the SAC, count them together. So what I would say is whoever is receiving the tests does the counting. If I'm an SAC and I'm giving you a box or a bin of tests, you count the tests and the answer booklets. You sign your name or initial your name, and then the number of test booklets and answer booklets that you received. When you return them to me, I count them to make sure I got back as many as you say you took, and then I initial and put the number as well. As soon as the testing session is done, the test should be collected by the SAC, again stored in a locked room with limited access. Only people who require access should have a key. Don't give sample test booklets to TAs as part of the training. They could have one during the test administration because there are some times when it might be useful to show test takers where certain things are. That's fine. They can have a demonstration booklet then. They shouldn't be looking through the test booklet. That's a violation of test security. But they can have a demonstration booklet. Here are some examples of actual test violations. That we've seen all of these here at PDE. It's not an exhaustive list, but it is a good list Lots of examples. Misuse of accommodations. Giving kids accommodations that they don't need and that aren't even allowed, like reading the math test to the entire class when that's not one of their accommodations, or reading the reading test aloud. That's not an accommodation. Under proctoring is our term for just inadequately monitoring the test. In one session that I saw, test administrator handed out all the test booklets. When kids got started testing, the test administrator went to the front of the room, turned his back on the kids, and got on his computer. That's under proctoring. Over proctoring is essentially cheating. You're telling kids too much. You're too involved in the test with them. Changing answers, encouraging students to change answers is a violation. Giving test materials back to students to complete or add more. We've had instances where a test administrator would give the test back to the student and say, for this open-ended question, you didn't write enough. You have to write more. That's enhancing the answers. What happens also, though, is a student will hand in his test, say that student's done with the test. 5 minutes later, the student says, oh, I forgot to answer the open-ended questions. The test administrator can't give the test booklet back to that student. Can't view secure test materials, for example, in that demonstration booklet. Don't discuss specific test questions with students. I think most people get this during the exam. Most people get it prior to the exam. Sometimes they don't get it after the exam. Teachers are teachers. That's who they are. What they do is want to help kids. So sometimes what happens is the test is done, a student will say, I didn't understand how to do this question. And then the teacher will probe and ask about the question and talk about how to do it. I get that they want to help, but that's still a violation of test security because the questions are still secure. Don't read aloud the math question or answer choices. When doing so, will cue the correct answer. We have read aloud guidelines that will help with this. Make sure all the materials are removed or covered from the walls. Not doing so is a violation. And they have to be covered with something opaque. We can't cover them with cellophane and count that. Students can't have cell phones during testing. TAs shouldn't have cell phones during testing. There are some schools that say that their TAs use the cell phone to contact central office or the administration or the SAC when testing is done. If that's the case, make sure the cell phone is put away, not in use, not accessed during testing. Don't give reminders to students. Don't tell them, we covered this. Remember, we talked about this last week. Students should not have access to anything that takes pictures. This is getting harder and harder to enforce. Students shouldn't have smartwatches. There are a whole lot of devices out there that can be very easily hidden that can take pictures. Get rid of anything from the students that can take pictures. Let them know that as well. Don't copy or record any part of the secure test materials. For example, there's a formula sheet for math. You can copy that. That's not a secure test material. But nothing that's secure should be copied or recorded. So what happens if any of these violations or any other violations occur? For educators, some consequences, generally most consequences, are determined by the school or the district. It could be anything from a verbal reprimand to termination. We've had all of those happen. If the violation is severe enough, PDE could pursue revoking the certification of the person suspected of the violation. And there have been times in the state where there have been criminal charges for people violating test security. So all of these are possible. For students, if a student's involved with a violation, and the most common violation is a cell phone violation. The students involved put a do not score label on that student's test booklet and answer booklet. I'm sorry, just on the answer booklet. The student, in order to get a score, has to retake the exam with using a different test form number during the same testing window or wave. Possible consequences to a student: if that student compromises the security of the test, for example, by taking a picture of a test question and posting it online, we can charge them for the cost of developing that test question, and there can be fines to pay. Test questions can be very expensive. Those costs could be $8,000. That's a lot of money to pay for just joking around with taking a picture of a test question. If there are other consequences, that's up to the LEA. You decide what you want to do with the student. Some schools suspend them, but that's up to you. Students, as well as test administrators and proctors and teachers and substitutes, should be aware of the consequences prior to testing, especially the students. All test security violations must be reported to PDE immediately unless, this is also new, unless the violation involves a cell phone where the security of the test has not been jeopardized. It's still a violation, but this particular violation can be handled by the LEA and does not have to be reported to PDE. Here's an example. Students taking a test, their backpack is on the floor, it's sealed. Halfway through the test, their cell phone goes off. They weren't accessing their cell phone during testing, but it's still a violation. So that student should receive a do not score label, have to retake the test, but we don't need that information. You don't have to report that to us because there was no test, no jeopardizing the security of the test involved. So here's some reminders. Couple pages, couple slides of reminders. Actively proctor, but don't over proctor. Encourage the class, but not individual students, to do things. For example, check your answers. Report all prohibited actions, all suspected violations. Cover everything that relates to testing content, everything. Do ensure that students sitting next to each other have different test form numbers. When we monitor, we ask about that. If that's not done, you'll get dinged for that. Do not review student test or answer booklets except as in the accommodations part. We used to say, look through the student answer booklet for stray marks and erase any stray marks. Don't do that. We don't want you to do that anymore. That's an old guideline. Don't provide answers to students. That's pretty obvious. Do not assist, direct, or counsel students during the administration of the test in any way that would influence student answers. Certainly if a student is having a meltdown, counsel that student. But that's not going to influence their answers. Don't do it in a way that will influence their answers. Don't alter, influence, or interfere with the test response. Fill in an unanswered item or instruct the student to do so. You can't say, you didn't answer question number 19. Make sure you answer that. Don't discuss or provide feedback regarding test items. We talked about that, especially after the test. Don't have the students use their answer sheet as scratch paper. What some test-taking strategies say is you cross off all of the wrong answers and then you fill in the right one and erase all the other marks, or you bubble in all the answers you think might be correct and then go back and erase the ones that are incorrect. Don't do that. You can do that in a test booklet, just don't do it on the answer sheet. Once a student's finished testing, they can sit quietly or read for pleasure. They can't do work in the tested subject. When it comes to monitoring, there's essentially two types of monitoring we do. One of them is their data forensics. We get reports from DRC about lots of data. There's numerous things that we get from DRC about the data forensic stuff. But our big one is our on-site visits. All of our on-site visits are unannounced. We're just going to show up in the morning and we're going to say, I'm Charlie Wayne, I'm from PDE, I'm here for a monitoring visit for the Keystones. We also want to look at a lot of documentation when we do our monitoring visits. We're going to see what some of that documentation is in a minute. But first, for the data forensics stuff, some of the things that we get, we see how often students erased or what they erased. If they're testing online, we know how long it took them to answer a question. We know how often they change their answer. We know if the answers are changed, even with paper and pencil, from wrong to right, right to wrong, or wrong to wrong. And students really don't erase very much. So when we get information from DRC that says a whole lot of students in Mrs. Smith's class erased a lot of their answers from wrong to right, we become suspicious. So we get all of this information. We get statistical analyses of student performance. So maybe in one year, a certain group of kids did really poorly on literature and really well in math. Well, now the next year, they're all doing really well in literature and really poorly in math. That could be a red flag. It might not be. It might just mean that the district changed their instruction, they beefed up their literature program. Could mean a lot of things. Not all of them are bad, but it could be a red flag. So we get all kinds of information. But when we come to monitor, some of the things that we're going to look for are the training agendas and sign-in sheets. We talked about them. We want to see the master test schedule. We want to see small group rosters. We want to see the makeup test schedule. Sometimes when we come, the makeup test schedule hasn't been created because we don't know what kids aren't there and when we'll be able to test them. I get that. But have at least an outline. Tell us what you're going to do, how it's going to be created, when it's going to be created. One of the most important pieces of information, documents that we want to see is the PA Secure ID distribution list. That's very important. We want to see the sign in and sign out sheet for TAs getting and returning the tests. We want to see the Keystone exam security certifications from the previous year. We know you don't have them signed for this year because testing isn't done yet. But we want to see that they're signed from the previous year and saved. We want to see the specific school or district procedures for parental requests to view the test, not the ones from our handbook. We want to see what yours are. And if any parents did opt their child out, we want to see the letters that they sent. Again, to report any suspected test violations, call us 844-418-1651 or email us at ra-ed-pssa-keystone@pa.gov. Any other contact information could call JGift or email Jay. You can call me or email me. Jay's number is 717-783-1144. His email is rgift, not jgift, rgift@pa.gov. My number is 717-783-0358, and my email is cwayne@pa.gov. Any other information, check out our website. If you have any questions, you could call or email Jay or I, and we'll do our best to get answers for you. Thanks for participating today. I hope that it was valuable. Again, any questions, let us know. Thank you.